The morning sun cast long shadows across the rolling Virginia countryside. As Congressman Daniel Sickles adjusted his opera glasses, peering toward the distant smoke rising from Manassas Junction, it was July 21st, 1861, and Washington's elite had arrived by carriage with picnic baskets and champagne, expecting to witness what they believed would be a brief, civilized demonstration of Union superiority over the rebellious Confederate forces. General Irvin McDowell's Federal Army of 35,000 men had been marching south for days, their blue uniforms gleaming in the summer heat as they advanced toward the strategic railroad junction where Confederate General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard had positioned his forces. The Union commander felt the weight of political pressure from President Abraham Lincoln and the Northern press, who demanded swift action to crush the rebellion before it could gain momentum. In the Confederate camp, Beauregard studied his maps by candlelight in the pre-dawn hours. The Creole general, a veteran of the Mexican War and former superintendent of West Point, understood that this first major engagement would set the tone for what many still hoped would be a short conflict. His 22,000 troops were positioned along the meandering Bull Run Creek, a natural defensive barrier that would force the Union forces to cross at predictable points. The political stakes could not have been higher. In Richmond, Confederate President Jefferson Davis had authorized Beauregard to engage McDowell's advancing army, while in Washington, Lincoln faced mounting pressure from radical Republicans who demanded immediate military action. The phrase "onto Richmond" had become a rallying cry in Northern newspapers, particularly in Horace Greeley's influential New York Tribune, which had been demanding aggressive military action since the bombardment of Fort Sumter 3 months earlier. As the first rays of sunlight illuminated the battlefield, neither commander fully grasped that they were about to participate in an engagement that would shatter the romantic notions of warfare held by both sides. The volunteer soldiers on both sides, many of whom had enlisted for only 90 days of service, carried with them the confidence of their respective causes and an almost festive attitude toward what they expected to be their first and possibly only taste of combat. McDowell's battle plan appeared sound on paper, a diversionary attack at the stone bridge over Bull Run, while the main force would circle round to strike the Confederate left flank near Sudley Ford. The strategy reflected classical military doctrine and had been approved by the aging General Winfield Scott, the hero of the War of 1812 and the Mexican conflict. Yet as the morning mist began to lift from the Virginia countryside, revealing the true complexity of the terrain and the positions of both armies, it became clear that this would be no ordinary engagement. The amateur nature of both forces, commanded by professional officers but filled with enthusiastic volunteers who had never experienced the chaos of battle, would transform what both sides expected to be a decisive engagement into something far more significant and terrifying than anyone had imagined. The thunder of artillery echoed across the Manassas Plains as Captain Charles Griffin's battery opened fire at 5:30 in the morning, signaling the commencement of what Union officers confidently expected would be a swift victory. The diversionary attack at the Stone Bridge proceeded according to McDowell's carefully crafted plan, with Brigadier General Daniel Tyler's division engaging Confederate Colonel Nathan Evans' small force of South Carolinians and Louisianians. Evans, a West Point graduate known to his men as Shanks for his thin legs, quickly recognized the feint for what it was. Through the dust and smoke of the early morning engagement, his scouts reported large columns of Union troops moving northwest toward Sudley Ford, clearly attempting to outflank the Confederate position. Without waiting for orders from Beauregard, Evans made the crucial decision to abandon his position at the Stone Bridge and race toward the threatened flank with his 1,100 men. Meanwhile, Colonel Ambrose Burnside's Rhode Island Regiment, part of the main Union flanking force, splashed across Bull Run at Sudley Ford in high spirits. The crossing had taken longer than expected due to the narrow ford and the inexperience of volunteer troops, but by 8 o'clock in the morning, Union forces were establishing themselves on Confederate soil. The sight of Federal troops streaming across the creek sent ripples of alarm through the Confederate command structure. At his headquarters near Mitchell's Ford, Beauregard initially struggled to comprehend the true scope of McDowell's flanking maneuver. The Confederate general had developed his own offensive plan, hoping to strike the Union left flank while they were presumably focused on the Stone Bridge. However, the reality of the Union movement forced him to abandon his aggressive intentions and rush Rhine Fork, immense toward the Henry House Hill, where Evans was desperately trying to establish a defensive line. According to contemporary accounts from the Richmond Examiner, the confusion of the early morning hours reflected the amateur nature of both armies. Staff officers galloped between commanders carrying contradictory orders, while regiments marched and countermarched as their colonels struggled to locate their assigned positions on unfamiliar terrain. The first serious combat began around 9 o'clock when Evans' men, reinforced by Colonel Francis Bartow's Georgians and Brigadier General Barnard B's Alabamians, engaged the advancing Union columns near Matthews Hill. The crack of musket fire and the acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air as both sides experienced their first taste of organized warfare. The volunteers, many of whom had never fired their weapons in anger, discovered that the reality of combat bore little resemblance to their parade ground drilling. Union Colonel William Tecumseh Sherman's brigade, crossing at an undefended ford upstream from Sudley, added additional pressure to the Confederate left. Sherman, a former superintendent of a military academy in Louisiana, who had resigned his position when the war began, led his troops with the methodical precision that would later make him famous. His flanking movement threatened to envelop the thin Confederate line completely. As the morning progressed, the weight of Union numbers began to tell. Evans' small force, fighting desperately to buy time for Confederate reinforcements, found themselves slowly giving ground toward the Henry House Hill. The retirement was conducted in relatively good order, but the sight of Confederate troops falling back sent waves of excitement through the Union ranks and corresponding anxiety through the Confederate command structure. The battle that both sides had expected to conclude by noon was only beginning to reveal its true character as the July sun climbed higher in the Virginia sky. By noon, the Confederate line along Matthews Hill had crumbled under the relentless pressure of McDowell's superior numbers. General Barnard B, his Alabama brigade bloodied and retreating, spotted a familiar figure positioned stoically on Henry House Hill. There stood Brigadier General Thomas Jonathan Jackson, with his Virginia brigade, formed in perfect battle line, behind the military crest of the hill, seemingly oblivious to the chaos unfolding below. There is Jackson standing like a stone wall, B reportedly shouted to his retreating men, though whether in admiration or frustration would be debated by historians for generations. Let us determine to die here, and we will conquer. The nickname Stonewall would follow Jackson for the remainder of his life, though B himself would not survive the day to see how prophetic his words had become. The Henry House Hill represented the last defensible position before the road to Manassas Junction lay open to Union forces. Jackson had positioned his 5 regiments with the tactical eye that had made him a respected instructor at the Virginia Military Institute. His men, many of them farmers and mechanics from the Shenandoah Valley, lay flat behind the crest while Federal artillery pounded the slope below them. Union Captain James Ricketts and Captain Charles Griffin, confident in their early success, advanced their batteries to within close range of Jackson's position. The aggressive placement of the guns reflected the prevailing military doctrine that artillery should be pushed forward to support advancing infantry, but it also exposed the crews to devastating musket fire from concealed Confederate positions. As Federal infantry advanced up the slope in support of the guns, Jackson's Virginians rose from their concealed positions and delivered a crushing volley at point-blank range. The Union attackers, many of them New York and Massachusetts volunteers who had never experienced such concentrated firepower, reeled backward in confusion and growing panic. The carefully planned assault began to dissolve into isolated groups of men seeking cover wherever they could find it. The critical moment came when Confederate reinforcements, including Colonel Jeb Stuart's cavalry and fresh infantry regiments, began arriving on the field. Stuart, a flamboyant West Point graduate who would become the embodiment of Confederate cavalry, led his horsemen in a charge that scattered the exposed Union artillery crews. The sight of gray-clad troopers sabering artillerymen and capturing the guns sent shockwaves through the Federal ranks. President Jefferson Davis himself had arrived from Richmond by train, bringing with him General Joseph Johnston's Army of the Shenandoah, which had slipped away from Union forces in the valley to reinforce Beauregard. The concentration of Confederate forces, achieved through effective use of the railroad system, demonstrated the strategic importance of Virginia's transportation network and marked one of the first times in military history that railroads played a decisive role in rapid troop movement. Contemporary accounts from Harper's Weekly describe the afternoon fighting as a confused melee, where regiments on both sides fired upon their own men. Due to the similarity of uniforms and the chaos of battle, the lack of standardized uniforms meant that Confederate units wearing blue-faced Union regiments, clothed in gray, creating deadly confusion in the smoke and dust of combat. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, what had begun as an orderly Union advance had transformed into a desperate struggle for control of Henry House Hill. The amateur nature of both armies became increasingly apparent as command and control broke down. Under the stress of sustained combat, officers found themselves leading men they had never seen before, while soldiers became separated from their units in the maze of woods and ravines that characterized the battlefield. The afternoon sun beat mercilessly down on Henry House Hill. As the battle reached its crescendo round 4 o'clock, the modest home of 85-year-old Judith Henry, who had refused to evacuate despite the approaching armies, stood at the center of the maelstrom. Confederate and Union forces surged back and forth across the hilltop in a deadly dance that would claim the life of the elderly widow, making her one of the first civilian casualties of the war. General McDowell, sensing victory within his grasp, committed his reserves to what he hoped would be the final assault. The 14th Brooklyn Regiment, known as the Red-Legged Zouaves for their colorful uniforms modeled after French colonial troops, advanced up the slope with their distinctive battle cry echoing across the battlefield. Their exotic appearance, complete with baggy red trousers and white gaiters, had made them celebrities in New York, but their tactical effectiveness was about to be tested under fire. The confusion of battle reached its peak when the 33rd Virginia Regiment, wearing blue uniforms that had not yet been replaced with Confederate gray, advanced toward the Union line. Major William Berry, commanding the Federal artillery, hesitated to fire upon what appeared to be Union reinforcements. The Virginians approached to within 70 yards before unleashing a devastating volley that decimated the gun crews and sent panic rippling through the Union ranks. Colonel William Sherman, his uniform torn and his horse killed beneath him, struggled to maintain order among his increasingly demoralized troops. The future architect of the March to the Sea found himself in the unfamiliar position of conducting a fighting withdrawal, something his West Point training had not adequately prepared him for. His brigade, which had performed admirably in the morning's advance, now faced the psychological shock of seeing apparent victory transformed into potential defeat. The turning point came with the arrival of additional Confederate reinforcements, including the brigade of Colonel Arnold Elzey, whose men had been rushed from the Shenandoah Valley by railroad. According to battlefield accounts published later in the Southern Historical Society papers, Elzey's fresh troops struck the Union right flank at precisely the moment when Federal morale was most vulnerable to the psychological impact of Confederate battle cries, particularly the ear-piercing rebel yell that would become synonymous with Southern infantry attacks, unnerved many Union volunteers who had never heard such sounds in their peaceful northern community. The wild, ululating cry, described by one Federal officer as resembling the howl of banshees, added an element of primitive terror to what had begun as a genteel military exercise. As the afternoon wore on, individual acts of heroism and cowardice played out across the disputed ground. Private Francis Brownell of the 11th New York Fire Zouaves earned lasting fame by bayoneting James Jackson, the proprietor of the Marshall House Hotel in Alexandria, who had killed Colonel Elmer Ellsworth, the regiment's beloved commander, in a dispute over a Confederate flag. Such personal dramas, magnified by the close-knit nature of volunteer regiments, added emotional intensity to the tactical situation. The collapse began gradually, then accelerated rapidly as word spread through the Union ranks that Confederate cavalry was threatening their line of retreat. General McDowell's carefully planned battle, which had proceeded so promisingly in the morning hours, now faced the reality that amateur armies could not sustain the complex maneuvers required for decisive victory. The volunteers, who had enlisted expecting a brief summer campaign, discovered that war demanded reserves of courage and endurance they had never tested. By 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the Union Army's orderly withdrawal had degenerated into something approaching panic. What began as a tactical retreat from Henry House Hill transformed into a rout when Confederate artillery began shelling the Cub Run Bridge, the primary escape route back toward Washington. The sight of artillery rounds exploding near the narrow span sent terror through the ranks of volunteers who had never experienced such concentrated firepower. The psychological collapse of McDowell's army reflected the fundamental difference between professional soldiers and enthusiastic amateurs. While the officers, many of them West Point graduates, understood the necessity of maintaining formation during a withdrawal, their volunteer enlisted men possessed neither the training nor the experience to execute such a complex maneuver under fire. Regiments that had maintained good order during the advance dissolved into streams of individuals seeking the quickest path to safety. The presence of civilian spectators, who had arrived from Washington expecting to witness a glorious victory, complicated the retreat immeasurably. Congressmen, journalists, and society ladies who had brought picnic lunches to observe the battle now found themselves caught in the tide of retreating soldiers. The contrast between their festive expectations and the grim reality of defeat symbolized the broader national awakening to the true nature of the conflict. Senator Henry Wilson of Massachusetts, who had ridden out to observe what he expected to be the war's concluding battle, found himself assisting wounded soldiers and helping to clear the roads for retreating artillery. His first-hand account, later published in the Congressional Globe, provided Northern readers with a sobering description of how quickly military confidence could evaporate. Under the pressure of sustained combat, Confederate pursuit remained limited, partly due to the inexperience of Southern commanders in exploiting victory, and partly because their own forces had suffered significant casualties and disorganization. General Beauregard, despite urgings from President Davis to pursue the retreating Federals aggressively, lacked the cavalry and fresh infantry necessary to transform tactical victory into strategic triumph. Most importantly, Bull Run established the psychological framework for the war that followed. Both sides now understood that victory would require unprecedented sacrifice and sustained commitment. The romantic period of the conflict, characterized by colorful uniforms and enthusiastic rallies, gave way to the grim determination that would define American warfare for the next 4 years. The young men who had marched toward Manassas, expecting a brief adventure, returned home with a deeper understanding of war's true nature. Their accounts, shared in countless letters and newspaper interviews, prepared the American people for the long struggle ahead. Bull Run had taught both North and South that the price of their competing visions would be measured in blood and treasure on a scale previously unimaginable in American experience. As the summer of 1861 drew to a close, the United States faced a future fundamentally altered by those July hours along Bull Run Creek. The battle had not decided the war's outcome, but it had determined its character, ensuring that the American Civil War would test the nation's resolve, as no previous conflict had done. The retreat revealed the logistical challenges facing both armies. Union supply wagons, ammunition trains, and medical personnel became hopelessly entangled with fleeing soldiers, creating massive traffic jams on the narrow country roads leading back to Washington. The Quartermaster Corps, staffed largely by civilian contractors with no military experience, proved incapable of maintaining supply lines under the stress of combat conditions. According to contemporary accounts from the New York Herald, the scene along the Warrenton Turnpike resembled a nation in flight rather than a military withdrawal. Abandoned equipment littered the roadside as soldiers discarded heavy knapsacks, blankets, and even weapons in their eagerness to reach safety. The psychological impact of this material abandonment would resonate through both armies, demonstrating that citizen soldiers required different leadership approaches than professional troops. By nightfall, the streets of Washington filled with exhausted, demoralized soldiers who had left the capital, that morning confident in their cause and capabilities. The transformation of these men, many still wearing torn and muddy uniforms, provided a stark visual reminder that the rebellion would not be suppressed. Through a single decisive engagement, hotels, boarding houses, and private homes throughout the city opened their doors to accommodate the influx of retreating troops. The political ramifications of the defeat reverberated immediately through the Union capital. Secretary of War Simon Cameron faced demands for his resignation, while General McDowell found himself the target of criticism from politicians who had pressured him to advance before his troops were properly trained and equipped. The dawn of July 22, 1861, broke over a transformed Washington. The confident city that had sent its army forth to crush rebellion in a single stroke now faced the sobering reality that the conflict would be neither brief nor bloodless. In the War Department, Secretary Simon Cameron worked through the night, sending telegrams to Northern governors requesting additional volunteer regiments and trying to assess the true extent of the previous day's disaster. President Lincoln, who had spent the evening receiving fragmentary and contradictory reports from the battlefield, now confronted the political and military consequences of defeat. The loss at Bull Run had shattered the illusion that superior Northern resources and population would automatically translate into swift victory. More significantly, it had demonstrated that the Confederate States possessed both the will and capability to conduct sustained military operations. The casualty figures, while modest by later Civil War standards, shocked a nation that had expected minimal bloodshed. Union losses totaled approximately 481 killed, wounded, and missing, while Confederate casualties numbered around 387. These numbers, representing sons, husbands, and fathers from communities across both regions, brought the reality of war directly into American homes for the first time since the War of 1812. General Winfield Scott, the aging hero who had opposed rushing untrained volunteers into battle, now found his cautious Anaconda plan receiving renewed consideration. Scott's strategy of blockading southern ports while gradually building professional military forces appeared more realistic in light of Bull Run's lessons about the limitations of volunteer enthusiasm versus military professionalism. The defeat prompted immediate changes in Union military policy. Within days of the battle, Congress authorized the enlistment of 500,000 three-year volunteers, acknowledging that the conflict would require long-term commitment rather than short-term enthusiasm. The 90-day enlistment period that had characterized the war's opening phase proved woefully inadequate for creating effective military forces. Lincoln's selection of General George Brinton McClellan to replace McDowell reflected the President's recognition that the Union needed commanders capable of transforming volunteers into soldiers. McClellan, fresh from victories in Western Virginia, brought a reputation for organization and training that seemed perfectly suited to the Army's immediate needs. His appointment marked the beginning of a more professional approach to military operations. Contemporary newspaper coverage, particularly in the Richmond Dispatch, celebrated the victory as vindication of Southern fighting spirit and military leadership. The battle elevated figures like Jackson and Stuart to hero status throughout the Confederacy, while providing concrete evidence that the South could compete militarily with the North. Despite disadvantage in resources and population, the international implications of Bull Run extended far beyond American borders. European observers, particularly in Britain and France, took note of the Union's military embarrassment and began seriously considering diplomatic recognition of Confederate independence. The battle demonstrated that the American conflict might develop into a prolonged struggle that could affect international commerce and diplomatic relations. Perhaps most significantly, Bull Run destroyed the romantic notions about warfare that had characterized both sections' initial approach to the conflict. The reality of organized violence, the sight of dead and wounded soldiers, and the collapse of military formations under fire provided a harsh education in the nature of modern warfare. The picnic atmosphere that had surrounded the battle's opening hours would never again characterize American military operations. The echoes of Bull Run's gunfire had barely faded when both North and South began the grim process of preparing for what they now understood would be a protracted and bloody conflict. The battle that was supposed to end the rebellion had instead demonstrated that American resolve on both sides ran deeper than anyone had imagined, setting the stage for years of unprecedented carnage. In Richmond, Confederate leaders celebrated their victory while simultaneously recognizing its limitations. President Davis understood that while Bull Run had bought the Confederacy time and international attention, it had also committed the South to a military struggle against an enemy with vastly superior resources. The victory had been tactical rather than strategic, and the fundamental challenges facing the Confederate cause remained unchanged. The transformation of both armies began immediately. General McClellan arrived in Washington determined to create a military force capable of executing complex operations under fire. His insistence on extensive drilling, professional officer training, and systematic organization reflected hard-won lessons from the Manassas battlefield. The volunteers who had fled in panic from Henry House Hill would be transformed into the disciplined ranks of the Army of the Potomac. Northern industry responded to Bull Run's wake-up call with remarkable speed and efficiency. Weapons manufacturers, textile mills, and transportation companies began retooling their operations to support sustained military operations. The economic mobilization that would eventually overwhelm Confederate resistance traced its origins directly to the shock of the first major defeat and the recognition that victory would require total national effort. The battle's impact on military tactics and strategy extended throughout the conflict. Officers on both sides studied the engagement's lessons, recognizing that volunteer enthusiasm alone could not substitute for professional training and leadership. The importance of railroad transportation, demonstrated by Johnston's rapid movement from the Shenandoah Valley, would influence operational planning for the remainder of the war. Bull Run's political consequences reshaped the Union's approach to prosecuting the war. The radical Republicans, emboldened by evidence of Southern military capability, began advocating for more aggressive policies regarding slavery and Confederate property. The battle marked the beginning of the transformation from a limited war for Union preservation into a total war for national transformation. The international ramifications continued to unfold as European powers reassessed American military capabilities. The Confederate victory suggested that Southern independence might be achievable, encouraging diplomatic initiatives that would complicate Union foreign policy. Throughout the conflict, the battle thus had consequences extending far beyond the Virginia countryside where it was fought.